live today in a world that is pressing us between an obnoxious political correctness and obscenity. And it looks like we don't have any third option than either to join this or that. We have been developing a thinner skin and have become more insecure. And what used to be appropriate last year may not be appropriate this year. And what is appropriate to say this year may not be appropriate the next year. And there is a trend to that. So much that books are written to show us the words that are acceptable at this age, and these books are being updated all the time. I try to take a look at those books, something like that book that we will see on the screen now. And for the truth of me, I don't know if this is a joke or not, because I have seen in the news a few weeks ago that a university actually published a similar book that replaced the words that we thought are comfortable for us and that are okay for our daily use with new words. I don't think that's the truth, but there is actually a book that was published by a university, a similar book. And I got a hold of a short list. I just chose a few words that I will be sharing. This is not from this book. This is from another book. And once again, I don't know if this is true or just a joke. For example, criticism is not an appropriate word to say anymore. That can be offensive. Instead of criticism, you should say unjust self-esteem reducer. Instead of evil, you should say niceness deprived. Garbage collector, sanitation engineer. That's my favorite because I used to be a sanitation engineer and I have no idea how to collect our garbage. Homeless person, residentially flexible individual. Lazy, motivationally dispossessed. Old, chronologically gifted. Instead of poor, say economically marginalized. Instead of prisoner, say client of the correctional system. Instead of short, say altitudinally disadvantaged. Instead of ugly, say under-attractive. Instead of fat, say horizontally challenged or person of substance. Instead of a man, say oppressor. And this one is certainly a joke. Instead of a hurricane, say hurricane. And guess why? But here is the thing. I mean, what is the other alternative to, you can see that in the presidential campaign now. People are saying they are sick of this trend of political correctness, that they want the alternative. And that alternative was not good either. I mean, to not have any regard for people at all. This is not the healthy thing to do. And this is a valid question, a relevant question to us. Where should we Christians fit into that? Which of those extremes should we join? And that's what inspired me to write my sermon today, I Am Offended, which, by the way, when I gave it to Jason this morning, I gave him the thumb drive that has this presentation. He said, which one of these? I said, I'm offended. He said, I'm trying to help. In a world that promotes the outrage industry, an industry that is a billion-dollar industry now. I mean, you say the wrong word, you dress the wrong way, you eat the wrong thing in front of me, drink the wrong thing, and I'm going to be offended and I'm going to file a lawsuit against you. It's a billion-dollar industry today. How should the church respond to that? And what would be the Christian attitude toward that? Well, the Bible has the answer to that if we read the Bible, the scripture, with a humble attitude toward God and toward our fellow human beings. We should learn which of those extremes or not should we join to deal with that situation. When the church first started, it was diverse. it had people from different backgrounds. And in many churches, we read in the New Testament, the letters that Paul wrote to many of those churches. We will be talking about the first of them, the church in Rome. They were so diverse that the very fact that there is somebody who is a Jew in the church was offensive to those who converted from among the Gentiles. And what would be Jewish was offensive to the Gentiles. What was Gentile was offensive to the Jews. When I was in school at Sunset International Bible Institute, I read a book that I honestly don't remember whether it was written by a member of the church or not, and I bought into it. I was just a student. I did not have the spiritual discernment, and that person said that God wants us to be segregated. Because, well, the Bible has congregations that has members that converted from either the Gentiles or Judaism. So they were segregated back then, so we should be segregated now. Of course, according to that, I should not be a member of this church. But this is not what the Bible says. And the best example of a church that was mixed, a church that was diverse, is the church in Rome. And that's where we get our first tip from today's class, that a Christian should expect and respect cultural differences. The church in Rome once again had Jews and Gentiles who converted to Christ. Rome, the capital of the Roman Empire back then, had a lot of Jews. When the Romans finished the invasion of the Holy Land, shortly before the birth of the Messiah, they brought and resettled a lot of Jews in Rome. They actually had their own ghettos by the time Jesus Christ was born. And the Jewish community in Rome was so active that at the Pentecost, there were so many Jews who heard the gospel and responded to the gospel and became Christians, and they went back to Rome and they established the Church of Christ in Rome. Many other people from among the Gentiles, the Roman Gentiles who did not have the Jewish background, joined them in that church. And the church was predominantly Jew when it started, the church in Rome. But then later, when Claudius Caesar expelled all the Jews from Rome, including those who converted to Christ, because Claudius could not tell between a Jew and a Jew who converted to Christ and a Jew who did not convert to Christ. We read about that, I think, in Acts 18. That's when we are introduced to a couple of them, Aquila and Priscilla. That's when the church started to become more predominantly Gentile than Jews. And people started to be so intolerant to each other that Paul thought it was necessary to write to those people, grow up. Different people just came from different cultures, and you are expected to respect those cultural differences. People just talk differently, and they dress differently, and they eat differently, and they drink differently. They listen to certain kind of music. They talk in a certain way. They probably worship in a different way, as long as it is biblical. And you should expect that, and you should respect that. Paul writes about that in details in Romans 14. I remember in 1992, I think I was an 8th grader, and that's when the United Nations Special Committee started to search for the Iraqi weapons of mass destruction. And that was, at that time, considered an outrageous violation of the sovereignty of Iraq. Of course, at that time, no one would ever lay a fingertip on a foreigner in Iraq, which many people think that was a good thing. But it was not a good thing, because the Iraqi government was already mobilizing the Iraqi people against those foreigners. And a whole generation grew up that was completely phobic, xenophobic to foreigners, especially Americans. And they had a show or a report that talked about the work of one of those United Nations special committees, those with the blue hats that were searching for the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And the show was poetic. The news anchor that made that show recited the report in a poetic way to mobilize and to appeal to the basic emotion of the human being, and that would be hatred, to mobilize the Iraqi people against those foreigners who do not like them, who are there. And one of them had a hat that looked like a cowboy hat. Remember, that was 92, so I was 13, I think. And the news anchor, the commentator, said, "Look at that man. Look at the hat that he's wearing. How similar it is to a cowboy's hat." And I was thinking, and I was 13, really? A hat offended you? That was in Iraq. Do we have this here in America or not, when people dress differently? Do you find that offensive or not? That was actually the case in the church in Rome, as well as many other congregations among the early Christians who came from different backgrounds. Yes, it was common for people to be either from a Jewish background or from a Gentile background in a single congregation, simply because the world back then was not advanced in transportation and people could not just move from a place to a place. Communities were segregated, but not a community that was as diverse as Rome. In one of my travels, I stayed with a family. The head of the family is a deacon in the Lord's Church, a congregation of the Lord's Church. The whole family came from East Europe, an Eastern European country. And they lived like a stereotypical Eastern European family. They did not have TV. The girls were playing the piano all the time, and something that was very fancy. The food that they had was East European, and they used to drink a glass of wine with every meal. Now, in some communities, that would be offensive. Okay? Should we point that out to them and say, well, this is wrong, you're Christians, you should not do that? Or should we say, well, okay, and then we come to the community that sees that as offensive and judge that community for having that attitude? Neither. Because Christianity is a faith that is for the adults. And we do not have lists of absolute do's and don'ts. Paul addresses that issue in his letter to the Romans, saying in chapter 14 and verse 5, one person esteems one day above another, another esteems every day alike. Some people celebrate Christmas. You want to celebrate Christmas? Fine. It's just a Christmas tree and Santa Claus and gifts. Somebody else would say, well, Christmas is of a pagan origin, and I'm not going to celebrate Christmas. Fine, do not celebrate Christmas. Let each be fully convinced in his own mind. By the way, there are absolutes in Christianity. And if somebody wants to be indulgent in idolatry, or somebody wants to pervert the gospel of Christ or the true Christian living, that's a different thing. But once again, there is something that is called cultural differences that we should expect and respect. Paul continues to say in verse 6, he who observes the day observes it to the Lord. And he who does not observe the day, to the Lord he does not observe it. He who eats, eats to the Lord, for he gives God thanks. And he who does not eat, to the Lord he does not eat, and gives God thanks. He later says in verse 21 of that same passage, it is good neither to eat meat, nor to drink wine, nor to do anything by which your brother stumbles, or is offended, or is made weak. It can be right, it can be wrong, that's none of your business, Paul says, because he says that God is the judge. Verse 12, so then each of us shall give account of himself to God. Therefore, verse 13, let us not judge one another anymore, but rather resolve this, not to put a stumbling block or a cause to fall in our brother's way. Once again, the way probably Arabs dress can be very offensive to many people. Unfortunately, I received this email from a major ministry in the Lord's Church entitled From a Preacher in South Dakota. That preacher was upset of the fact that people are speaking Arabic in the United States. And he is offended and outraged, and he wrote a 4-page, strongly worded letter. Wake up, America. There is somebody who is speaking Arabic. Once a nice city, talking about Dearborn, on a continuing downhill slide. You can't work in the school system front offices if you don't speak Arabic now. That's a lie, by the way. I work among the refugees, and one of the things that I do is that when people first want to register, they don't have anyone to translate to them. So I go them to like the school system, the administration and the teachers. They don't speak Arabic and they don't have any interpreter. So I help them with that. No, he's saying that the whole school speaks Arabic and they don't speak English. He says that Michigan has more Muslims than any other states in America. That's also a lie. They have more in California. Kids, assuming girls can't tell for sure, roaming the hallways in full-blown burqas. That man is offended for seeing people dressing different than him. By the way, as we studied 2 sermons ago, those people think that they are the godly people because they are dressing this way. And then he puts an Arabic part in the email, and he says, if this doesn't scare you for being an Arabic, you haven't been watching what has happened to our country in recent years. I bet you can't guess what this is. And then he says, well, it's a part of the instructions for how to apply for food stamps in the great state of Michigan in Arabic, exclamation mark. Have we gone completely nuts, says the preacher of the Lord's church that stands behind the pulpit of the gospel of Christ every Sunday? The camel's nose is officially in the tent in Michigan. And then he says, now in Michigan, when you call the public assistance office, you are told to press 1 for English, press 2 for Spanish, or press 3 for Arabic. When did Arabic option sneak into our culture? Folks, this is not Christian. And the Bible tells us that people come from different cultures, and we should expect that and not to be scared by that, and we should respect that. And that is both within the church and outside the church. The second point in our class today is that a Christian should not offend others. And the text that is connected to this point is from 1 Corinthians, another letter that Paul wrote to another congregation that was less diverse than that in Rome. The main problem in the church of Rome was that people came from 2 different backgrounds, Jews and Gentiles. And Jews were offended by the way Gentiles live and eat and drink. Likewise, Gentiles used to be offended by the way Jews live and eat and drink and talk. They had cultural prejudices against each other. This is not the case in Corinth, which was less diverse than the church in Rome. It was almost entirely Gentile. Like the background of those people was almost entirely from paganism, and they became Christians. And the main difference is not between Jews and Gentiles, but between strong believers and weak believers. And Paul is encouraging the strong believers to live in a way that does not become a stumbling block to the weak believers. And the main thing that he was talking about is meat. Corinth was an outrageously pagan city. And almost every time you buy meat, every time you get meat, the only way you get meat is to get the meat that is offered to idols. The strong Christians said, rightfully so, we have the knowledge that this meat is not bad in itself. By the way, they did not have a Jewish background. If they had a Jewish background, they would never eat that meat, even after they convert to Christ. But they came from a pagan background, and they said, well, the New Testament authorizes us to eat everything. All things are lawful. That's right, Paul says, but do not abuse that liberty in a way that causes your weak brother to stumble. Respect that weak brother. What was happening? to each meat that is offered to idols was viewed by the non-Christians and by the weak Christians, that would be the new Christians that are not mature in the faith, as taking part in idolatry and idol worshiping. Now those people who are new in the faith, who are not mature, just converted to Christ, and they are watching the older Christians, they are watching the stronger brothers. When they see them eat meat, they would say, okay, does that mean that I should go back to idol worshiping? And Paul said, no. You know that meat is okay, fine, keep that to yourself. But do not offend your brother. If you eating that meat can be a stumbling block, can be discouraging to your brother, can give the wrong impression to the pagans that will think that probably you are a pagan person, then don't do that. The same thing can be right and can be wrong. The same meat. That's why we said that Christianity is a faith of the adults. We don't have a list of do's and don'ts, absolute do's and don'ts. The same do's can be don'ts in different circumstances. And as Paul was talking about respecting the Christian liberty and not to abuse it, he says in chapter 10 of his letter, 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 32, give no offense either to the Jews or to the Greeks or to the church of God. A Christian should not offend anyone, whether another Christian, that is the church of God. Church of God, Church of Christ, same thing. Not the denomination of the Church of God that has a different decree than what the Bible teaches, but that church that belongs to God, that Jesus Christ bought with his own blood. Do not offend any Christian, and do not offend any Jew who is not a Christian, and do not offend any Greek, an idolater, a pagan who is not Christian. We are not called to offend those people. And that, of course, is as much as depends on you. Now, some people have already decided to be offended by you, whether you say something to them or not. We are also told to point out what is wrong and to continue to preach the gospel, expecting to be wronged, persecuted, oppressed, opposed. But we are told to continue to pursue what is true and what is right in a way that does not offend others. Paul says in Romans 12 that if it is possible, as much as depends on you, live peaceably with all men. Thank God he said that. Sometimes you want to establish a good relationship with someone as a Christian, as Christ is calling you to do. But that someone does not want that good and healthy relationship with you. And that's why Paul says, as much as depends on you. Verse 19, beloved, do not avenge yourself. We'll be talking about that more in detail in a few minutes, but rather give place to wrath. Anyone who offends you as a Christian is not offending you. He is not, or she is not sinning against you. They are sinning against God. And they will be given an account to God. And they will be responsible. And God is a just God. We are told not to offend others. Remember when Paul went to Athens in Acts 17, we read that his soul was provoked within him. He was disturbed when he saw that the city was given to idols. Steve Stamatis, the preacher of the Central Church of Christ, gave a presentation about the city of Athens that he visited. And he said that those idols were still there in every street corner. Paul was upset when he saw the idols, but what did he say to the Greeks or to the Athenians? Men of Athens, I see that you are religious in every way. And then he started to preach the gospel to them, using the illustration of an altar that they made to, not to a specific idol, but they labeled it to the unknown God. So Paul was respectful even to the culture that provoked his spirit. That would be the Athenians. It is not what you say, it is how you say it. I have been preaching the gospel among Muslims for 2.5 years now, which it may not be long, but this is 2.5 years longer than any other ministry in the Lord's church that is specifically directed toward Arabs and Muslims. And they love it. They love to hear about Jesus and to learn the gospel. They are not convicted most of the time, but that's the thing. I am not there to offend anyone, and I am only preaching the gospel to the unsaved because I love them and I want them to be saved. And I want to share the eternity with them. We should respect others, but we should not get involved in the others' practices if they were not right. Paul says in Ephesians 5 and verse 11, have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather expose them. For it is shameful even to speak of those things which are done by them in secret. Do not offend those. Tad gave many sermons about that when he said, imagine you going to Applebee's or one of those places that serve alcohol, and he would see a Christian brother or sister there, probably even using using weed behind the wall of that restaurant. In what way should you respond to that brother? First, what is your motive? Do you want to offend that brother or sister, or do you want to save that brother and sister? Paul also said in Galatians 6, brethren, if a man is overtaken in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness, considering yourself, lest you also be tempted. A spirit of gentleness. You shake that person's hand and you say, brother, I think that you have not been doing the right thing and you need to repent. Amen. In a very gentle way, in a very respectful way, because we are told as Christians not to offend anyone. A Christian should expect and respect cultural differences within the church. A Christian should not offend others, and a Christian should not be offended himself or herself. We are not allowed by the gospel to have a thin skin. Our faith is not the faith of those who are emotionally insecure. We have the ultimate security that came with the same package as the salvation that came from God through Jesus Christ. We are the children of God. We are not to be insecure emotionally. The Bible tells us to walk in love. This is Ephesians 5 and verses 1 and 2. Therefore, be imitators of God as dear children, and walk in love as Christ also has loved us, and given himself for us, an offering and a sacrifice to God for a sweet-smelling aroma. So a Christian is told to walk in love and not in insecurity and in thick skin. And what does that love do? Remember the series that Tad gave about love and the definition of love that was heavily based on 1 Corinthians 13. Love suffers long and is kind. Love does not envy. Love does not parade itself. And in verse 7, he says, love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. So a Christian is told to walk in love, and that love, we are told by a different place of the Bible, endures all things. So a Christian should endure all things and not be offended. Once again, those who sin do not sin against people, they sin against God. The psalmist David said in Psalm 51, against you only have I sinned and done this evil in your sight, after he sinned with Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah, and he committed adultery and murder. He said that he only sinned against God. Likewise, those who offend you and persecute you and say the wrong thing about you as a Christian, they are not sinning against you. They are sinning against your Father and the head of your kingdom, the kingdom in which you are a citizen. They will have to give an account to God. If you have this in mind, you will be more secure. The Bible tells us to commit everything to God. 1 Peter 4. Beloved, this is verse 2. Do not think it strange concerning the fiery trials which is to try you, as though some strange things happen to you. But rejoice, verse 13, to the extent that you partake of Christ's suffering, that when his glory is revealed, you may be also glad with exceeding joy. If you, verse 14, are reproached for the name of Christ, blessed are you. For the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. On their part he is blasphemed, but on your part he is glorified. Then he says in verse 18, if the righteous one is scarcely saved, where will the ungodly and the sinner appear? Therefore, verse 19, let those who suffer according to the will of God commit their souls to him in doing good as to a faithful creator. One major reason behind people's insecurity and getting offended is that they think that there is no one watching and that their right is lost. And that's why they pursue lawsuits over trivial facts or things that are said against them. But this is not what we are told and how we are told to be and how we are told to live. We are expected to suffer because of that. Hebrews 10:32. Recall the former days in which, after you were illuminated, you endured a great struggle with sufferings, partly while you were made a spectacle, both by reproaches and tribulations, and partly because you became companions of those who were so treated. The Christian persecution, according to this passage, comes either directly on you or because you are hanging around the other Christians. And no, it is not cool to be a Christian here in the United States any more than it is cool to be a Christian in Iraq, here in the 21st century, now in the 21st century, any more than it used to be in the first century. You can be persecuted either by reproaches or by tribulations, either through words or through the actions of the non-Christians. This is our call. This is what we are called for, to share those sufferings that Jesus Christ himself endured. Expect and respect cultural differences. Do not offend others, and do not be offended yourself. Why bother? Why should we do that? Why should we develop security and a thick skin? Paul continues in his letter to the Corinthians, first letter to the Corinthians in chapter 9, and he says in verse 19, for though I am free from all men, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win the more. Verse 20, and to the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might win Jews. If Jews knew that you respect them and respect their culture, they will listen to you. To those who are under the law, as under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. Verse 21, to those who are without law, as without law, not being without law toward God, but under law toward Christ, that I might win those who are without law. One word, one wrong word you say out of a reaction, a negative reaction towards somebody because you did not feel good about that person or about the cultural background of that person, and you will probably never see that person again, and he will never listen to you. Worse, he or she will tell his community that this is what Christianity is all about. And that would give the wrong image of the Christ that we are preaching to those people. Verse 22, to the weak I became as weak, that I may win the weak. I have become all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. Now this I do for the gospel's sake. That's the reason we should be strong and secure for the gospel's sake, that I may be partaker of it with you. That concludes our class. By the way, Brother Mike, this is not the course about Islam anymore. So we do not have any, we have given all the classes about Islam that I was planning to give, and we will have similar sermons, Lord willing, if Jesus did not come back, in the next weeks. Brother Lewis, would you lead us in the concluding prayer?